While 76-year-old Evelyn Carter lay unconscious in the ICU with tubes in her chest and machines breathing beside her, her 3 sons sat around her kitchen table, not discussing her recovery, but arguing over how much money they could get for her house before she woke up. And by the time Evelyn finally opened her eyes after emergency heart surgery, weak, frightened, and believing her boys would be there to help her home, the locks had already been changed. Her furniture had been sold. Strangers were walking through the rooms where she had raised her children, and the only thing her sons forgot to take was the tiny brass key hidden for decades inside her late mother's silver locket. A key that would lead Evelyn to a secret nobody in the family even knew existed. Evelyn had lived in the same blue farmhouse outside Knoxville, Tennessee, for almost 42 years, and every corner of it carried a memory she could still see as clearly as yesterday. The faded mark near the pantry door where Richard slammed a baseball bat as a teenager. The old porch swing her husband Walter built during one brutally hot summer before cancer took him away. The narrow hallway where Alan and Brent used to race each other in socks while she pretended to yell at them for scratching the floors. To outsiders, it was just an aging country home sitting on 3 quiet acres with peeling paint and a sagging fence. But to Evelyn, it was the entire story of her life stitched into wood and drywall. She had worked double shifts at a diner after Walter died just to keep that house, surviving on 4 hours of sleep some nights, so her boys would never know how close they came to losing everything. And for years she truly believed the sacrifices had meant something, because she raised polite sons who called every Sunday, showed up for Christmas, and hugged her goodbye before heading back to their own busy lives. But people change slowly, almost invisibly, and sometime over the years those boys became men who only called when they needed money. Richard, the oldest, had developed a gambling habit he constantly hid behind fake confidence and expensive watches he couldn't afford. Alan lost nearly everything trying to open a construction company that collapsed after 2 bad contracts. And Brent, the youngest, drifted through life following whoever spoke the loudest because making his own decisions terrified him. Evelyn saw the cracks, but refused to admit how deep they were because mothers often confuse hope with reality. Then came the morning everything changed. It was freezing outside, one of those bitter January mornings where the windows looked frosted from the inside, and Evelyn was standing in her kitchen making coffee when a crushing pain exploded through her chest, so suddenly she dropped the mug before she could even scream. The cup shattered across the floor as she collapsed beside the stove, gasping for air, while the world around her blurred into darkness. Her neighbor, Diane, found her nearly an hour later after noticing newspapers piling at the end of the driveway. By sunset, Evelyn was in intensive care after emergency surgery for severe heart failure, and doctors warned the family the next 48 hours would determine whether she lived or died. For the first day, her sons played the role of grieving children perfectly. They sat in waiting rooms pretending to worry, shook doctors' hands, and told nurses they just wanted their mother to come home safe. But behind closed doors, another conversation was happening. Richard started it. He mentioned the hospital bills first, casually, like a practical concern. Then he brought up the house. What happens if she can't live alone anymore, he asked. Alan immediately understood where the conversation was heading because he was desperate too. Brent hesitated at first, but not enough to stop them. Within days they convinced themselves they were being rational. The property was worth more now than it had ever been. The repairs were expensive. Their mother would probably need rehabilitation or assisted living. Selling the place quickly, they claimed, was the smart thing to do. But none of that was the real reason. The truth was simple greed wrapped in fake concern. Richard saw a chance to erase debt collectors breathing down his neck. Alan saw a way to save his collapsing finances. Brent saw brothers pressuring him into agreement because disagreeing meant standing alone. While Evelyn fought for her life surrounded by hospital machines, her sons met with a rushed attorney and dug through old paperwork searching for anything that gave them authority over her affairs. Richard manipulated the situation masterfully, painting their mother as permanently incapacitated and insisting decisions had to be made immediately. By the second week of Evelyn's hospitalization, a buyer had already toured the farmhouse. By the third week, contracts were signed. Furniture included. Family belongings included. Everything. The sons didn't even bother sorting through her possessions carefully. Her wedding album was boxed with kitchen plates. Walter's military medals disappeared into storage bins. Old handwritten birthday cards were tossed out with junk mail. None of them understood they weren't just selling a house. They were dismantling the physical evidence that their mother had once been loved there. Evelyn finally regained enough strength to leave intensive care 23 days later. Her chest ached constantly. Her body felt 20 years older, and every breath exhausted her. But the first thing she asked the nurse was whether her boys had brought her coat from home, because she wanted to see the farmhouse again. None of the nurses answered right away. They exchanged awkward glances instead. That was Evelyn's first warning that something was terribly wrong. 2 days later, Richard arrived at the rehab center, carrying flowers from the hospital gift shop that still had the price sticker attached. Alan and Brent stood behind him, refusing to meet her eyes. Evelyn smiled weakly from the wheelchair, expecting relief or affection from her sons after nearly dying, but the room felt cold before anyone even spoke. Richard finally cleared his throat. "Mom," he said carefully, "we need to talk about the house." Evelyn frowned slightly, confused. "What about it?" Richard inhaled slowly like a man preparing to deliver bad news he had rehearsed many times. "We sold it." For several seconds, Evelyn genuinely believed she misheard him. "Sold what?" she whispered. "The house, Mom," Alan said quietly. "We thought it was best." The words hit harder than the surgery itself. Evelyn stared at her sons while her heartbeat monitor ticked steadily beside her. And somewhere deep inside, she felt something tear loose that would never fully heal again. "You sold my home?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately because hearing the truth spoken out loud made even them ashamed for a moment. Richard rushed to justify it, talking about bills and stress and practicality, but Evelyn barely heard him anymore. All she could picture was strangers walking through Walter's living room, strangers opening her kitchen cabinets, strangers standing where her children once stood on Christmas mornings. Then Richard delivered the final blow. "You can stay with Alan for a little while until we figure things out." Figure things out. As if her entire existence had become an inconvenience needing temporary storage. Evelyn turned her face toward the hospital window, so her sons wouldn't see the tears sliding silently down her cheeks. And in that moment, she realized something horrifying. While she had spent her whole life protecting her boys from pain, not one of them had protected her from betrayal. Evelyn barely spoke during the drive to Alan's house after leaving the rehab center because every ounce of energy she had was being used to hold herself together, and the deeper they drove into the suburbs outside Nashville, the more unreal her life began to feel, as though she had died in that hospital bed, and this was some cruel punishment waiting on the other side. Alan tried making conversation twice, awkward little comments about traffic and the weather, but neither of them could ignore the truth sitting between them in silence. He had helped sell the only home his mother had left. His wife, Denise, greeted Evelyn at the front door with the strained smile of someone trying very hard to appear compassionate while secretly resenting every second of the situation. The guest room turned out to be a cramped storage space filled with old workout equipment, dusty Christmas decorations, and boxes stacked almost to the ceiling, with just enough room for a narrow bed shoved against the wall. Evelyn thanked them politely anyway because humiliation had exhausted her more than the surgery itself. The first few days passed quietly. She stayed mostly in the small room, sleeping often because her body still hadn't recovered, listening to the muffled sounds of a family continuing life around her while she felt like an unwanted visitor waiting for permission to exist. At night, she stared at the ceiling, replaying memories of the farmhouse over and over again. Walter laughing on the porch during thunderstorms, little Brent falling asleep beside the fireplace after Christmas dinner, the smell of cornbread cooling in her kitchen window. Sometimes she could still hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking in her mind, so clearly it made her chest ache. But the hardest part wasn't losing the house. It was understanding that her sons had watched her lying unconscious and still decided their own comfort mattered more than her dignity. On the 11th night, Evelyn woke around midnight needing water and slowly shuffled down the hallway, careful not to wake anyone. But as she neared the kitchen, she heard voices coming from the living room and instinctively stopped when she realized they were talking about her. "This can't be permanent, Alan," Denise whispered sharply. "Your brothers dumped this on us and disappeared." Alan sighed heavily. "I know." "No, you don't know," Denise snapped back. "Your mother needs constant attention. She's here all day, every day. We barely have space as it is." She almost died. And I'm sorry for that. But she can't live here forever. Evelyn stood frozen in the dark hallway, gripping the wall for balance, while each word cut deeper than the last. Then came the sentence that finally shattered what little remained of her heart. How long is your mother staying here? Denise asked quietly. Not Evelyn. Not your mom. Your mother. Like she was a burden delivered by mistake. Alan didn't answer immediately, and somehow his silence hurt more than if he had agreed. Evelyn backed away before they could see her standing there, returned to the tiny room, and sat awake until sunrise staring at her suitcase. She understood something clearly for the first time in weeks. She was no longer wanted anywhere. Not in her own home. Not in her son's homes. Not even in the lives she had sacrificed everything to build. The next morning she packed quietly while the house slept. She folded her few clothes carefully, placed her medication into her purse, and paused only once when she found the small velvet pouch the hospital had returned among her belongings. Inside rested the silver locket her mother used to wear every single day. Evelyn hadn't opened it in years. The chain was tarnished now, delicate with age, but touching it brought back memories of her mother instantly. Strong hands kneading biscuit dough, soft humming during storms, the smell of lavender soap lingering through the old house, where Evelyn grew up in the Smoky Mountains. Almost absent-mindedly, she pressed the tiny latch and opened the locket while sitting on the edge of the bed. Instead of photographs, something small slipped into her palm. A brass key, tiny, old-fashioned. Attached to it was a brittle piece of faded tape with handwriting so faint she almost missed it entirely. For Evelyn, when there is nowhere else. She stared at the words for a very long time. Her mother had died over 20 years earlier, yet somehow the message felt immediate, almost as though it had been waiting patiently for this exact moment in her life. Evelyn suddenly remembered stories from childhood about a small cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains near a town called Brier Glenn, a place her grandfather built during the Great Depression from scrap wood and river stone. She had spent summers there as a little girl catching fireflies beside the creek while her mother canned peaches in the tiny kitchen. After Evelyn married Walter, life became busy and the cabin faded into memory. Eventually, her mother stopped mentioning it entirely. Evelyn assumed it had collapsed years ago or been sold off quietly. None of her sons had ever even heard about it. But now, holding that tiny brass key in her trembling hand, she began wondering if her mother had hidden more than memories. Before anyone else woke up, Evelyn wrote a short note thanking Alan for letting her stay and quietly slipped out the front door, carrying her suitcase. The cold morning air stung her lungs as she walked toward the bus station 2 blocks away. She had no real plan beyond following the only lead left in her life. During the 8-hour bus ride east toward the mountains, Evelyn barely moved from her seat. Every bump in the road sent pain through her chest, but beneath the exhaustion something else slowly grew inside her. Hope. Tiny and fragile, but alive. By late afternoon, the mountains finally appeared outside the window. Endless blue ridges layered beneath gray winter clouds exactly as she remembered from childhood. Brier Glenn looked untouched by time when the bus dropped her off beside a small gas station. One diner, one church, one blinking traffic light. The same quiet town where summers once felt endless. Evelyn dragged her suitcase across the gravel lot toward the gas station store, uncertain whether anyone would even remember her family name after all these years. But the elderly man behind the register squinted at her for several seconds before his eyes widened. "Lord have mercy," he said softly. "You're Martha Bennett's girl, aren't you?" Hearing her mother's name spoken aloud nearly brought Evelyn to tears. She nodded slowly. The old man came around the counter immediately and hugged her before pointing toward the mountains behind town. "Cabin's still there," he said. "Your mama made sure of that." Evelyn's breath caught. "You knew about it?" "Everybody around here did," he replied gently. "Your mother paid taxes on that place every year like clockwork. Told folks it belonged to her daughter whenever she needed it." Evelyn felt dizzy hearing those words because suddenly the key, the note, all of it became real. Her mother had prepared this long before Evelyn even knew she would need saving. The road leading to the cabin was barely visible now, half swallowed by weeds and winter mud, and the uphill walk nearly exhausted her weakened body completely. But then she saw it through the trees. Small, weathered, crooked with age, but standing. Smoke stains still darkened the stone chimney. Rusted wind chimes moved gently on the porch, and hanging beside the front door was the same carved wooden bird her mother painted by hand nearly 50 years earlier. Evelyn's hands trembled as she lifted the brass key toward the old lock. For one terrifying second, she feared it wouldn't fit, and that this entire desperate journey had been built on false hope. Then the key turned with a soft metallic click. The door slowly creaked open. The scent inside hit her instantly. Pine wood, old books, fireplace ash, rain-soaked timber. And suddenly Evelyn wasn't 76 years old anymore. She was 8 years old, racing barefoot across these floors while her mother laughed in the kitchen. Dust covered most surfaces, but the cabin remained intact as though someone had been quietly preserving it all these years. A quilt rested folded neatly on the couch. Lanterns hung beside the fireplace. Family photographs sat untouched on shelves. And there, waiting in the center of the kitchen table as though placed only moments earlier, was a single envelope with her name written across the front in her mother's handwriting. Evelyn stood motionless in the middle of the tiny cabin kitchen, staring at the envelope with her name written across the front in her mother's delicate handwriting. And for several seconds, she couldn't bring herself to touch it, because nothing about this moment felt possible. Her mother had been gone for over 20 years, yet somehow it felt as though she had reached across time itself to leave behind one final act of protection for the daughter she somehow knew would one day need saving. With trembling fingers, Evelyn finally opened the envelope and unfolded the yellowed letter inside. Evelyn, it began. If you are reading this, then life has wounded you in ways I prayed it never would. People can disappoint us, even the ones we raise with love, especially them sometimes. But this cabin belongs to you, and it always will. I kept it hidden because I wanted there to be one place in this world nobody could take from you. If you arrive here broken, then stay until you remember who you are again. By the time Evelyn reached the end of the letter, tears blurred every word on the page. She lowered herself slowly into one of the old kitchen chairs and cried harder than she had cried in decades. Not only because of the betrayal or the humiliation or the loneliness, but because for the first time since waking up in that hospital, she no longer felt abandoned. Someone had thought ahead for her. Someone had loved her enough to prepare shelter for pain that had not even happened yet. That night, Evelyn lit a fire in the stone fireplace using logs stacked beside the porch, wrapped herself in her mother's old quilt, and slept more peacefully than she had since before the surgery. In the weeks that followed, life inside the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm that slowly stitched pieces of her back together. Every morning, she drank coffee on the porch, watching fog drift through the mountains while the creek behind the cabin murmured softly over the rocks. She cleaned one room at a time, sweeping away years of dust, polishing old furniture, opening windows to let fresh mountain air inside. Beneath the neglect, she discovered beauty everywhere. Her grandfather's hand-carved shelves still held jars of preserves long since expired. Old family photographs hid inside drawers untouched by time. A stack of handwritten recipes from her mother sat wrapped carefully in cloth beside the stove. Little by little, the cabin stopped feeling like a hiding place and started feeling like home. The people of Brier Glenn welcomed her quietly too, the way small mountain towns often do when they recognize someone carrying pain. The diner owner in town paid Evelyn to bake pies twice a week after tasting one of her peach cobblers. A retired carpenter named Walter Jennings repaired the loose porch steps in exchange for blackberry jam. Church ladies began dropping by with casseroles and gossip. Nobody treated Evelyn like a burden there. Nobody made her feel temporary. Back in Tennessee, meanwhile, the lives of her sons were beginning to collapse under the weight of their own decisions. Richard's gambling debts worsened after he lost nearly all the money from the house sale, chasing a desperate streak at casinos across Mississippi. Alan's marriage grew poisonous as financial stress and guilt poisoned every conversation inside the home. Brent drifted from job to job, increasingly haunted by what they had done to their mother, but too weak to confront his brothers directly. Then came the disaster none of them expected. During renovations on Evelyn's old farmhouse, the new owners uncovered severe structural damage hidden beneath the foundation, damage Richard vaguely knew existed but never disclosed during the rushed sale. The buyers filed a lawsuit almost immediately. Lawyers got involved. Court dates followed. Legal fees exploded. Suddenly the money that had seemed like salvation vanished almost overnight. And through all of it, One question kept resurfacing among the brothers. Where was their mother? Weeks passed before Brent finally tracked down a clue through an old hospital administrator who remembered Evelyn mentioning Brier Glenn during recovery. By early autumn, all three brothers drove into the mountains together for the first time in years, rehearsing apologies the entire way there. But none of them were truly prepared for what they found waiting at the end of that narrow dirt road. Evelyn stood in the cabin garden wearing worn gardening gloves and holding a basket of tomatoes against her hip when the truck pulled up. For a second, none of the sons even recognized her. She looked healthier, stronger somehow. The deep exhaustion that had hollowed out her face after surgery was gone, replaced by something calmer and steadier. Smoke curled peacefully from the chimney behind her, while late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees around the cabin. She looked like someone who had finally stopped surviving and started living again. Richard stepped forward first with a forced smile that collapsed almost immediately under Evelyn's quiet stare. "Mom," he said awkwardly, "we've been worried about you." Evelyn said nothing for several seconds. Then she asked softly, "Have you?" None of them answered. Alan stared at the porch floorboards. Brent looked close to tears already. Richard finally launched into explanations: stress, bad decisions, pressure, fear. But every excuse sounded smaller once spoken aloud in front of the woman they had betrayed. Eventually, the real reason for the visit emerged. The lawsuit, the debts, the financial disaster swallowing all of them whole. They needed help, needed advice, needed money if she had any left hidden away somewhere. Evelyn listened quietly while mountain winds stirred the trees around the cabin. Years earlier, she would have rescued them instantly. She would have emptied savings accounts, sold jewelry, worked herself sick if it meant protecting her boys from hardship. But something fundamental had changed inside her during those lonely weeks after the ICU. She finally understood that love did not require allowing people to destroy you. "I almost died," she said calmly once Richard finished talking. "And while I was fighting to breathe, you sold my home before I even woke up." Silence settled heavily over the porch. Brent began crying first, wiping his eyes angrily, while shame finally broke through years of avoidance. Alan followed soon after, unable to meet her gaze. Even Richard looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence he used to manipulate everyone around him. But Evelyn did not scream. She did not insult them. She did not seek revenge. The absence of rage unsettled them more than anger ever could. Instead, she walked inside the cabin for a moment and returned holding a framed family photograph. The one taken years earlier on the farmhouse porch during Walter's last Christmas alive. She handed it to Richard carefully. "You boys already took the house," she said softly. "But you don't get to take the rest of me too." Richard opened his mouth as though searching for words, but none came. Because deep down, all three sons finally understood the truth. Forgiveness was possible, but trust was something else entirely. After a few more painful minutes, the brothers quietly returned to their truck and drove away down the mountain road, leaving Evelyn standing peacefully on the porch beneath the fading orange sky. She watched until the truck disappeared through the trees, and strangely, she felt no bitterness anymore, only clarity. The creek behind the cabin flowed steadily through the evening silence while crickets sang from the woods. Evelyn lowered herself gently onto the old porch swing and wrapped her mother's cardigan tighter around her shoulders. For the first time in her entire life, peace did not come from sacrificing herself for others. It came from finally understanding her own worth after everyone else forgot it. The tiny cabin hidden deep in the Smoky Mountains became more than shelter after that day. It became proof that even after betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak, life could still offer another beginning when you least expected it. And every night before bed, Evelyn touched the small brass key hanging beside the front door and silently thanked the mother who loved her enough to leave behind one place in the world that nobody, not even her own sons, could ever steal away.